Welcome to this part of the collection. This is notable directors. I have other titles, other multiple titles with certain directors in the main part, but these are just ones of either my favorite directors or directors whose work really just goes together. Not trying to be an auteur diehard or anything, but anyway, that's just how I do my collection. It's just my own personal quirk. Anyway, so we're going to start alphabetically, and we're going to start with Alan. Here is the MGM letterbox release of Annie Hall. Of course, nice use of the original poster artwork put into the Laserdisc size. Of course, noting the winning of the 77 Best Picture Oscar. Digital mono PCM, so it sounds excellent. Very nice transfer. Here's the rear. Of course, this is pretty much a bare bones release, but it is from the early 90s, so it is a very nice transfer. There's also a Criterion version, which is also bare bones. I think they might be the same transfer. MGM and Criterion usually would either share transfers. Criterion also shared transfers with other studios, but usually MGM would later reissue a title that Criterion did with either the same element or a better element, and usually the MGM version will be a little bit better technically. MGM usually had a little bit more money and better equipment and stuff, and of course every year Laserdisc would get better and better. So here's that one. Next we have the MGM release of Alan's Interiors. Of course, this is a usually a lesser regarded film, but you know, I picked it up for cheap, so why not? Has digital mono PCM. Most of Alan's films are always mono, so you definitely don't want a remix of a dialogue heavy mono intended film. Bare bones, simple, very similar to the Annie Hall disc, but you have that. Next we have, I just picked this up recently. This is the Columbia letterbox release of Manhattan Murder Mystery. I haven't seen this in ages, so kind of interested to see what this looks like. Of here you have this typical Columbia TriStar style artwork, and of course this being a Columbia disc, hopefully, I don't know if there's a lot of rotters on this one, but of course I believe this came from the DADC plant, so you never know with those. Of course, digital PCM, early 90s disc, so hopefully if there's no rot in it, it should be pretty good. Next we have, going into Robert Altman, here is the Warner Brothers release of McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Altman's classic revisionist Western, which is very well known in film circles and for being an extremely murky film in both picture and sound. Famously, this was photographed by Vilmos Zsigmond, who flashed the negative to give it an extremely striking and very different look to it. And the mono track is extremely murky, especially in the first 20 to 30 minutes. So if you're seeing this film for the first time, don't expect it to... If it's not very clear to you, then it's not you. It's not your system either. This is a very good transfer for Laserdisc, especially for a Warner Brothers disc. They can typically be on the lesser side of video transfers for laser, but it's very good. And when you compare it to the DVD, I think this actually is slightly better. I think they're the same transfer, but the DVD kind of makes some tweaks and stuff. And of course, it's come out on Blu-ray now and looks great. But I still, this is a nice disc to have. And as with a lot of Blu-ray releases of mono films, sometimes they can overzealously clean up the mono track sometimes. So sometimes the Laserdisc actually still is a little bit better because it doesn't have all that extremely high noise reduction and cleanup where they kind of clean it up too much. But I haven't done any comparisons, so I don't know for sure, but that can happen. And this is a very nice Laserdisc, so if you see it, don't be discouraged. It's a very nice transfer of a very hard film to transfer and a great American classic, probably my favorite Altman film. Here is Altman's The Long Goodbye from 1973. This is a MGM letterbox release with the original mono track as digital PCM. This is a very nice disc, good transfer, nice color too. It's a very interesting film. Of course, being a gigantic Chandler fan, it takes a lot of liberties, but most Chandler, actually practically all Chandler adaptations do. So by updating it to the 70s, it is really in a class by itself. So it's definitely worth a watch. Very good Laserdisc. And this originally came from an old professor of mine, so I'm going to try and cover up the name tag. I couldn't get the sticker off, so here's the rear artwork, chapter stops and everything. So excuse my fingers covering that up. I don't think he'd appreciate phone calls or something. Anyway, so yeah, it's a very nice disc. It's out on Blu-ray now, but the Laserdisc is quite nice. Next we have the Paramount Director's Series edition of Paper Moon, directed by Peter Bogdanovich. This was a series of Laserdiscs that they did, and I think they only did a couple of these, and they have the imprinted autograph of the director across the side. The other ones I can think of were, I think Fatal Attraction came out this way, and Star Trek 4 as well. But anyway, nice release. Has the original mono track as PCM. Great 70s classic, and it has a introduction from Peter Bogdanovich, but other than that, that's pretty much all it has in terms of special features. Oh, and has a closing by Bogdanovich as well, so he basically bookends it. But all in all, it's a nice disc, and it was nice to see Paramount, trying to have their own line of special releases, even if they didn't go, very far with them. Nice letterbox transfer as well. So yeah, it's a nice disc. This is an interesting one. This is my other Bogdanovich title on laser. This is the film Texasville, which is the follow-up essentially to his famous Last Picture Show. But this is the director's cut extended version, which so far, to my knowledge, has only been released on Laserdisc. And actually, Bogdanovich has wanted to have this come out on at least DVD or Blu-ray, and it's just no one's ever really followed up on it or put the money up to do it. And if I remember correctly, they actually showed this at a film festival once not too long ago, and actually somebody had to go out and procure this particular Laserdisc, and everybody had to kind of crowd around and watch the Laserdisc copy. I have not seen the shorter cut, or I only saw part of it once on TV or something, so I can't tell you anything really about differences, but it is a substantial amount of additional footage and tweaks and stuff, and this is Bogdanovich's preferred version of the film. So if you see this one, definitely pick it up, and of course, if you haven't seen The Last Picture Show, do so immediately. I have that one on the Criterion release, which will be in the Criterion video. Alright, so next, I'm not really a big James Cameron fan, but with Laserdisc and James Cameron kind of go hand in hand, because all of his films have extensive Laserdisc releases and then fantastic box sets, and he was one of the people to really kind of push the format in terms of what you could do with home releases. So here is the original release of the Terminator from Hemdell and Image. It's a very nice transfer, but it is a print transfer, so you will get Q marks, and it is a different look and feel to the THX later release. So this is kind of nice to have for kind of a more, for lack of a better term, analog feel to it, even though this is an analog format. But I'll show you the rear. Of course, it's not as clean as the later transfer, but it does have the all-important original mono mix as PCM. And of course, Terminator was a lower budget film, made and released and mixed in mono. And the successive 5.1 remixes on the DVDs and Blu-rays are really, really bad. So you want to stick with the original mono track. And in terms of quality, you can't do better than Laserdisc. And it sounds really great. It's a fantastic mix for mono. So you really can't beat it. So next we have the THX mastered reissue from the mid-90s. I believe this was mastered from an interpositive of some type because it doesn't have the Q changes and it looks a little bit different. Much cleaner, fantastic transfer for Laserdisc, and it has the original mono mix. It's a little bit cleaner than the older disc, so if you want this film in its best possible quality on Laserdisc, you want this release. And also if you want the original mono track in its best version, you definitely want this release. And it's a single disc just like the other one. Nothing really in terms of special features. Of course, practically the same cover artwork design. And the only way you're going to tell the difference is, you know, the later dates and the fact that this has the THX logo and the purple bar across the top. But this is a very nice Laserdisc. It presents very, very, very well. And definitely grab either one if you come across them just for the mono track. But the older release is pretty much for, you know, if you just want to see what the other version looked like. All right, next we have the standard version of The Abyss. This is the theatrical cut, letterbox from Fox with the Dolby Stereo track presented matrixed on the PCM digital tracks. It's a standard Fox cover with the gatefold. Let me show you what this looks like. And you got some liner notes here. Of course, this being the shorter version, it fits onto 2 CLV discs. And of course, it's the standard Fox layout. Not a bad transfer, but it's definitely not a patch on the other ones for the extended version, which were mastered to be as good as humanly possible for the Laserdisc format at the time. And of course, you also miss all of the extra footage that was put back into the film or added on to the film for the extended release. So this is really for those who want to watch the theatrical version. And of course, this has not been released to Blu-ray yet, even though it's rumored to be coming out. But knowing James Cameron, if and when it finally does come out on Blu-ray, it's going to have a bunch of changes made. So, moving on, we have the mid to late 90s AC3 letterbox reissue of the extended version. The extended version first came out and was made for the CAV box set, but that did not have AC3. So, if you want the extended version and you want the benefit of having discrete 5.1 sound, you want this version. And this was essentially ported over to the early DVD release, which is the most current release of the film still. That's the last time they released it. So if you have that and you get this Laserdisc, it's going to look very familiar because it's the same transfer. But of course, that release does not have the 2.0 PCM stereo surround matrix audio. And that matrix audio is the same track that was on the box set release. So basically, this presents the movie, same transfer as CLV with the AC3 5.1. Of course, this gets the THX credit because they looked it over. Here you have the gatefold, which details the, it's called the restoration notes, but this breaks it down by chapter, what's been added and tweaked and changed from the theatrical cut you may be more familiar with. Here's this panel with your chapter information on the sides. And then a note about the jump cuts that sometimes appear in the film, because when they went back to make the extended version, they couldn't always find the frames around the original edits for the theatrical cut. So that's just saying you might notice some jump cuts every once in a while. Here we have the rear cover. Try to flatten this out. Sometimes these kind of want to poke out a little bit. All right. So, of course, this is a later 90s Fox disc, so they all kind of have a similar layout. Everything's kind of blocked in, but basically this is just if you want the long version of the film, but you don't want the box set with the extra features, and you want to have the AC3 5.1. I've kind of compared the two, and on a good system, I mean, the 5.1's, because it's discrete, it's a little bit better, but they're basically about the same. Extremely dynamic, very fantastic mix for the time period. So there's that. Next, we have the letterbox standard release of the theatrical version of Terminator 2. Of course, just like The Abyss, there's the extended version that was first released on VHS and Laserdisc. after the shorter theatrical cut played out in theaters. So it's a very common title. Of course, the original poster art looks fantastic on this. Very frameable. Has the Dolby Stereo surround track encoded as digital PCM. It sounds very, very good. Of course, Terminator 2 is practically legendary for its sound mix. Unfortunately, it's not the original CDS 5.1 mix, which was the Cinema Digital Sound System. It was a method of encoding 5.1 PCM onto 35 millimeter and 70 millimeter prints, but had a lot of technical flaws that made it eventually get outshone by Dolby Digital and later DTS. So it kind of fell by the wayside after being used on roughly about 10 films. So, and successive issues have remixed the sound. Even the long version Laserdisc has its own particular remix. And the later versions really are not as good as the older ones. And but in order to hear that CDS track, you're going to need to track down either the late release Japanese squeezed letterbox Laserdisc, or the original DVD that was not remixed, has that same 5.1 CDS track, but it is lossy Dolby Digital. But anyway, this still packs a wallop. It's still the same overall basic design, but it's not discrete and can't take the full advantage of having discrete channels. So I get that aside, get a nice gatefold. And this design kind of got used on the successive boxes and other reissues, but it does look very nice. Here's this panel, and you see they've kind of printed Arnold to where he kind of comes off. It's glossily printed on this. So this is a nice little release that you can pick up for practically nothing because they're very common. So if you want a nice copy of the theatrical version in letterbox, this is probably what you're going to go for. There's your rear cover artwork. Pretty straightforward. So there's that. Now here is the standard letterbox release of the special edition long version, which uses the alternative poster artwork. This exact thing is used, this exact image is used for the insert cover in the special edition box set, which is practically the same as this. It just has a few extra features, but otherwise it's the same discs and transfer and soundtrack. The soundtrack on this is also Dolby Surround matrixed with a center channel and a mono surround. It does sound a bit more robust than the theatrical cut, but this was specifically remixed for this special edition release. So they at least were bringing the original mix into specifically the home theater environment at the time, which was limited pretty much to 4 channels, because this was before AC3 5.1 had entered the home video market. So only the last releases in Japan and such on Laserdisc T2 had a 5.1 track. And of course the first DVD has that CDS track. Anyway, here's the gatefold. And same thing as the Abyss, the chapters are marked with the additions and subtractions. And you have your chapters down here. Here's the included letter from James Cameron telling you about how they created this disc and transfer. And at the very end tells you and encourages you to turn it up loud. That's probably the one time I'll follow advice from James Cameron, because this disc should be played loud. It sounds quite excellent. Even though it is a custom home video remix, it sounds great even on modern setups. So using the Dolby Pro Logic modern versions like PL2X and such. So here's this. And here, if you can see the whole gatefold. I always love these letters, especially this one's actually printed, and it feels really wonderful. It feels like you pulled it right off his desk back then. Okay, here's the rear cover. Of course, you have the THX Mastering logo, and yeah, that's pretty much the standard version for the long cut. Now we move on to the genius of Frank Capra. This is the Columbia classic release of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, the 1939 masterpiece of American cinema. This is a very nice release. It's mastered directly from the materials they stored at the Library of Congress. This was done from the photochemical restoration in the 1990s, so you're going to see damage and some marks and some cube lips and things. But it is a very nice experience to see this kind of a lot closer to what it would have looked like in 1939. Well, probably more like 1940, because original prints on the run wouldn't have that much damage. But it's not bad in terms of damage. It's much better than the older transfers. And of course, the new Blu-ray restoration is fantastic, but the audio source they had to work with was not in the best of shape. So it's interesting to go back to this older photochemical restoration. And of course, the mono is encoded as PCM. So this is a nice disc to have in conjunction with the Blu-ray. And of course, the first DVD was this same photochemical restoration. So if you have the old DVD from the early 2000s, this will be very familiar to you. So, and actually, the first time I saw this film was the VHS version of this. So I just wanted to pick it up and see how the old restoration looked on Laserdisc. So there's that. Next, we have the Republic 45th anniversary release of It's a Wonderful Life. Of course, this was originally released by Criterion and other labels when the film fell into the public domain. Then Republic took it over, and this was I believe their second attempt. This was the first release on Laserdisc to have digital sound, and it has the original preview and the first appearance of the Making of It's a Wonderful Life documentary. That's on the successive releases. I kind of like the usage of black and gold for this. It does look really nice. It has a gatefold. Show you this here. And then here's some liner notes. Let me show you the rear cover here. And for this film, I think picture-wise, I still prefer the old Criterion CAV box, even though it has analog sound, because it looks identical to the 35mm print I saw last year that you can still see at various art houses that apparently was from the best surviving materials. And the current Blu-ray is mastered from the same source as the Paramount DVD from about 2006, and it's got a bunch of digital noise reduction, and it just doesn't have the same depth and the black levels and the same silver quality that these older transfers do, that really reflect what the actual print looks like. So this is a very good disc, very good transfer, but in terms of picture quality, I still prefer the Criterion one. But this is not bad by any means, but you do get the benefit of having the original mono track as a digital PCM, whereas the new DVD and Blu-ray have only a lossy mono track that actually has some pops in it. So this actually is probably the best sounding release of anything. The Republic later did a box set version for the 50th anniversary, and I haven't seen that. I've seen the VHS was actually the one I owned as a kid, was the 50th anniversary VHS, so it was the same master. So I think they just reused the same thing and just encoded it much better, but that's kind of harder to find, so I haven't been able to track that one down yet. So this can be had pretty cheap, so it's a nice release to have, and hopefully Paramount does a 4K release at some point, because they could really use it. All right, next we have Capra's 1948 film Riding High. This is a Paramount release with digital mono PCM. It's pretty bare bones, but if I remember correctly, the DVD is pretty much bare bones too. This film doesn't get talked about very much, but you see it's very standard Paramount, but gets the digital sound because it's from the early 90s. So nice little disc for a film that doesn't get enough talk. Oh wait, this is 1950. It's a 1950 film. I forgot I said 1948, I think. All right, so we're moving on to Francis Ford Coppola. Here we have sorry about the plastic scratching. Here we have The Godfather on the Paramount CLV release that is open matte 1.33 to 1 Academy. I don't know if it's truly open matte. I think it just has a little more on the top and bottom. And but the reason why I picked this up is I originally saw the Godfather trilogy on the dual VHS releases that had this same cover art and transfer. They share the same transfer. But the real reason why I wanted to pick this up is it has the original mono tracks as PCM on the digital tracks. And the Blu-ray Coppola restoration, while it is absolutely fantastic, courtesy of Robert Harris and the restoration team, the original mono tracks are only lossy Dolby Digital, whereas the terrible 5.1 remixes are lossless encoded. So that's why I picked this one up. But the mono tracks on the Blu-rays are still great. So this is just a little alternate I picked up. Plus, I wanted to look at it again with the 1.33 framing, the way it was when I first saw it on tape and the way TV airings used to be. So here's the rear, standard kind of older style Paramount release, very much like the VHS tape. You know, it has an older look to it, meaning kind of more of an older analog look to it, a touch hazy, the color's a lot lighter, but you know, it actually shapes up pretty well for its age, so it's not a bad disc. It's interesting to have for the 1.33 framing and the mono. Next, we have a really important Laserdisc title. This is the Letterbox 1991 release of Apocalypse Now, which was famous for its use of surround sound in the 70mm engagements. What makes this release special is that Walter Murch went back to the original mag tracks and specifically mixed them into the Dolby encoder. So this is the first release to accurately present what was heard in the 70mm premiere engagements. So it is a theatrical cut, and the audio is encoded as Dolby Surround PCM, and it will decode out into 4-channel. But it has, as far as I can tell, no dynamic range reduction. This thing is extremely dynamic, and I think it sounds better than any other release of the film, even the Redux versions. I'm not a big fan of the Redux longer cut, but and I actually think this even sounds better than the 5.1 reissue Laserdisc. And all this stuff is minor. I only noticed that because I compared them directly, but this disc can be had for extremely cheap, and it is a wonderful disc for the sound. Of course, the aspect ratio is a bit of a debate because the cinematographer Vittorio Storaro for a while insisted on all versions being matted to 2.0 to 1 due to some theories he had. And of course, the film was originally shot at 35 millimeter scope, 2.35. So you will have a slightly compromised aspect ratio on this and the DVDs. And it wasn't until the Blu-ray release from Lionsgate that the 2.35 framing was restored. But you can pick this up for practically nothing. Let me show you the gatefold. Very simple. Got a note from Coppola when this was released in '91 about the film and what it meant to him at that time. You have more photos in the gatefold. You have a standard Paramount release, and most important, you have a little blurb here about the technical transfer. But most important is Walter Murch specifically coming back and supervising the audio transfer for Laserdiscs. So that's Apocalypse Now. Now we have the late 90s AC3 5.1 reissue of Apocalypse Now, which very lovingly uses the original poster art over the whole Laserdisc cover. And of course you get the Paramount remastered and digital surround sound, meaning 5.1 AC3, Dolby Digital. And here's the artwork. You see, so I got the same letter blurb, your chapter stops, and some liner notes. You see they were able to use the gatefold with much more precision. And it's basically the same information on the back, but it's kind of laid out a little more eye-catchingly. And I mean, if you compare the two discs and all three surround tracks, because this has PCM, stereo, Dolby Surround, and 5.1 AC3, I mean, they're all going to sound almost identical, but for some reason, I just prefer the PCM on the 1991 release. It's just, it just sounds slightly better to me. That may be because of my equipment, but of course that disc is much cheaper. This one's much harder to find, so that also helps. So, finishing out with Coppola, we have the release of The Godfather Part 3. Same thing, this is Part 1. This is a 1.33 disc, so it is opened up. I don't know if it's a true open matte release, because that's always very hard to tell, but it just has a little more headroom than the letterbox release, and it has the original soundtrack in Dolby Surround, which that's how the film was released in 1991. All the 5.1 tracks are remixes, so it's always nice to have that as a source, have the original track. So there's that. Here's the standard looking Paramount rear cover, and it's the extended version, which has pretty much become the standard definitive version around the world so far. So there's that. Now we move on to John Ford. Here is the Turner Home Entertainment and Image release of the classic John Ford picture, The Informer. This is one of the great films of the 1930s, extremely important. If you haven't seen it, do so immediately. This was the best release on Laserdisc, has digital sound, the original mono track. Otherwise, it's pretty much just a straight up image release, just has the typical image style jacket with the information in the center. It's pretty nice. The transfer is pretty good, like most image discs. Not quite as good as some of the top studios, but it's just, I was excited to find it. It's not a very common title to come across. So that's The Informer on Laserdisc. Next, we have the Warner final release of Stagecoach, the 1939 masterpiece Western from John Ford. This has the original mono track encoded as PCM. Very nice transfer, I believe, from the best existing vaulted elements at the time. So this is a very, very, very nice black and white disc. Pretty much all of the later classic releases from the studios were all pretty good across the board. So I think it's from like 91 or 92. So it's a very nice disc and in perfect shape. So standard Warner style jacket there. Next we have Ford's The Grapes of Wrath from Fox. And of course, this is the same artwork that was on the VHS release of the time. Digital sound with the original mono mix PCM, so it sounds great. Looks very nice. Very nice transfer. Here you have the jacket with a lovely amount of liner notes for a Fox disc, so they treated this with a good amount of respect. They usually do with this and the others, like this film and others came out, the ones that came out in the Studio Classics line on DVD, and the current Blu-ray is quite good, but it's nice to have this as a alternate, and again, not a super rare disc, but not one you see every day. So here's an interesting one. This is Warner's Technicolor restored version of the 1956 masterpiece, The Searchers. There's a lot of debate on the color of The Searchers. Shot in VistaVision, which was the format originally designed by Paramount. Ford worked in it a couple times, and Hitchcock was most famous for working in VistaVision. But the color timing has been different on most every release, and this one was done in about 92 or 91, and it was reputed as being from original dye transfer non-fade Technicolor elements, but later on, various studio people have said, oh, well, we just did the best we could at the time, and it's not really accurate, in defense of the new HD version on Blu-ray, which is also the subject of debate. So there's a lot of debate among film fans and restorationists and various industry professionals about which version of The Searchers is most correct to original prints, because even Technicolor dye transfer prints from original theatrical runs are full of variation between individual prints. They don't fade, but no two are 100% alike. So this is interesting to have. I personally, I kind of lean towards this one. I do quite enjoy it. I do kind of prefer it over the newest version of the color timing that's on Blu-ray, but of course the Blu-ray has tons of nice detail in HD, and VistaVision was absolutely incredible, so there is that. This has the original mono track as PCM as well, so that's always helpful, because a lot of Blu-rays, and I think the Searchers Blu-ray, the mono is on there, but it's lossy. I can't remember if it's lossless. It was an early Warner release on Blu-ray, and a lot of those had lossy audio tracks. So here's the rear, and it uses the standard Warner style artwork, but this is a very nice release to have. The last release on Laserdisc was the same transfer recycled to the early DVD, and it was pretty much this transfer with some adjustments made, I believe, but I haven't got to see that Laserdisc. It's pretty rare and can be a little expensive, so you can pick this up for very little, and this has the beautiful alternate artwork, which is just absolutely breathtaking. The last Ford picture we have here is The Horse Soldiers, forgotten film that it's a little bit of a mixed bag. There was some production troubles and headaches that happened when they were shooting it, but it's a MGM release, letterbox, with the original sound in PCM mono, MGM style gatefold with production stills and your chapter stops, and a theatrical trailer at the end. Otherwise, MGM usually was pretty good about having the trailer at the end, but otherwise it's bare bones. But has the nice MGM style jacket. They were always pretty good at getting stills and poster artwork integrated into the jacket very well, and it's glossy, so it feels nice. I think MGM across the board were kind of the top end of regular Laserdisc releases. So on to John Frankenheimer and the 1962 masterpiece, The Manchurian Candidate. This is the MGM widescreen collector's edition using original poster artwork. It just looks fantastic on Laserdisc. I think this is the best cover of any video release so far. This has the original mono track in PCM, and which was very important because until the Criterion and Masters of Cinema Blu-ray releases, this was the only way to have the original mono track in lossless, and the 5.1 remix is pretty bad. So here I have the gatefold. Fantastic usage of the gatefold area with original posters, press clippings, and newspaper articles, and production stills. Then you have all of your chapter information, and then side 3 concludes with the supplementary section. So this was the first big deluxe release that this film received, because it was out of print for a good number of years. And here's a wonderful note from John Frankenheimer, who actually had his signature printed on here. He was a big enthusiast of Laserdisc and recorded many audio commentaries, including for this film, that had later been ported to other releases. Thankfully, he was able to do that when Laserdisc was in its prime before his death in the early 2000s. So there's that. This is another. If you haven't seen it, see it immediately. It hasn't dated one second. Next we have John Frankenheimer's The Train, MGM letterbox release. A little bit of damage, but not bad. This has a director's commentary from Frankenheimer. It also has the isolated musical score on the analog track. Has the original mono mix in PCM, black and white, beautiful transfer. Was recycled for the DVD, and then the I believe the Twilight Time Blu-ray went out of print and then came back. I don't know if it's still in print or not, but that's also very nice. But the Laserdisc has the MGM style of your chapter information on the side, and then original poster artwork looks wonderful, followed with some production stills. I'll show you the rear cover. There we go. pretty standard for MGM, but they seem to figure out what worked for Laserdisc covers and just kind of stick with it. Very nice. Not the rarest of discs, but not too easy to find. Here we go with another one that's not too easy to find, but is a very, very, very important film, and thankfully in this day and age is finally getting the reputation it deserves. This is Frankenheimer's 1966 film Seconds. This was the first release to be fully uncut. There's a couple sequences in here that are quite shocking for a 1966 film that were cut on the original release and weren't restored until this Laserdisc. The original DVD from Paramount was a port of this. This is letterboxed with PCM mono and commentary from Frankenheimer on the analog tracks. The current Criterion disc is fantastic on Blu-ray. This is just a powerhouse of a film. I won't say anything about it. You need to go in cold. It has images and moments you will never forget, and this is probably it's difficult to say what Frankenheimer's best film is, but this is arguably it. Between this and Manchurian Candidate and Ronin, definitely. But this is certainly Rock Hudson's most dramatic performance, and if you haven't seen it, do it immediately. Don't spoil anything. Just watch it, and you'll be having nightmares about it. So that's Seconds, and we have John Frankenheimer's Grand Prix. This film was famous for being photographed and presented in Cinerama. Well, photographed 70mm and presented in Cinerama, projected onto the deeply curved screen with the fantastic auto racing footage, especially with these gigantic cameras mounted on these cars going at speed. Has the original sound mix encoded as Dolby Surround. Originally, this was multi-channel stereo in Cinerama theaters, and there has been discussion that the later releases on DVD and Blu-ray that have a 5.1 mix, that the original audio has been remixed and has removed things like dialogue panning, which is very common on remixes. So that's why it's important to have this one. I haven't really sat down with that to check for myself, but here's the gatefold. I'll show you this panel. So no information printed in here. Everything's here on the back. So that's Grand Prix. Here we have Frankenheimer's film Black Sunday, letterbox edition from Paramount. Nice transfer, very, very good thriller that really doesn't get talked about enough. It's really one of those great 70s, almost paranoid thrillers. There's a lot of those that dealt with paranoia in the 70s, everything from Marathon Man to 3 Days of the Condor and Parallax View. But this is a really, really, really good thriller. You know, it's one of those that every time you go back to it, it's much better than you remembered. Here's the rear cover. I don't remember if this had a commentary recorded for it. Yeah, I don't think this has a commentary, but I think I think he later recorded one and it was on the DVD. Can't remember for sure, but yeah. So, all right. So last we have Billy Friedkin's masterpiece To Live and Die in L.A. This is a 1.33 version of a letterbox film, so it does have a little bit more on top and bottom, but it is recomposed from the original. I don't think it's open matte. I just think it's opened up a little bit. On Laserdisc, this was released twice. First was not by Image. This is by Image, but this has a digital PCM track of the original Dolby Stereo mix. And this film has a very inventive mix for the time. There's a lot of usage of the surrounds in a creative way. And, of course, using the full stereo width for Wang Chung's soundtrack score. So it is a little bit different flavor to the 5.1 remix, which that thankfully doesn't change anything. But I think now if you get the British release from Arrow of the new 4K restoration, I think they include the 2.0 Dolby Stereo as an alternate. But this is nice to have. It's not common to find this release from Image. It's much better than the older one, a lot cleaner too. It's nice to have that original track in PCM and to have this with the different framing. But of course, if you haven't seen this film, you definitely should. I think it's one of the best films of the 80s, and I do think this is Friedkin's best work, hands down. And coming from a giant fan of The French Connection and other Friedkin films, that's saying a lot. But I think this film is still criminally underrated, and I can't say enough about it. So so that'll conclude part 1 of the director's shelf. We'll come back with H onwards.